This is a celebrating academic and early career research session this afternoon, and we're thrilled to welcome several presenters from different universities and research institutions across the UK and beyond. It's brilliant that some of the papers I'm sure you're excited about as well, some fascinating research that's going to be shared.
I realised today I've set myself the somewhat ambitious challenge of showcasing how archaeological research can be possible when archaeological fieldwork is not. My research seeks to develop an archaeology of Western interaction with a particular site, Palmyra, using archival sources from travel literature to art, a banknote to an exhibition, influenced by years of visitors to the site. Palmyra will be an ancient Syrian site known to many of you from the headline destruction of its major monuments by Islamic State militants between 2015 and 2017. An oasis of civilization deep in the Syrian steppe, sandwiched between the Mediterranean and the Euphrates, Roman-era Palmyra is world-renowned for its idiosyncratic art and architecture. Its iconic tower tombs welcome generations of travellers and visitors to the site through the Valley of the Tombs. Structures like the tomb of Yamliku have been levelled by extremists. Many of these are beyond repair. Undoubtedly, reconstruction will occur at the site under the auspices of a resurgent al-Assad blasted with Russian special forces. Unsurprisingly, archaeology has been the major force behind new research into the ancient city's secrets for the past 300 years. Whether ancient or art historian, theologian or epigraphist, all interpretations of Palmyrene culture have hinged on the fieldwork of teams from France, Poland, Norway, and as far afield as Japan. Owing to the onset of the Syrian civil war in 2011 and the destruction of much of the ancient city, including the temples of Bel and Baal-Shamin, no new archaeological research has been possible on site. There is no likely return date for many of the teams due to the rise of Russian regional dominance. In this context, classical reception has an important role to play in continuing research into places like Palmyra that are now otherwise off limits. I believe it is in the application of the intersecting skill sets of classical reception, critical heritage studies, and archaeology that we as academics can retain relevance even as the primary claims to the future study of Palmyra's legacy pivots eastwards. One relatively untapped source in Palmyrene studies remains the footprint of travellers, visitors, and academics' interaction with the place. In today's talk, I hope to give you a taste of the diverse range of sources that are available in the history of exploration and interaction with the city, before moving into modern debates that rage around the future of the site. As an archaeologist travels down through different layers of antiquity, so too can a student of classical reception. My thesis focuses on the long 18th century, from the city's rediscovery for the West in 1678 through to its inclusion in the earliest architecture museums in Paris and London. I take a reader episode by episode through a cultural history of Palmyra's rise, from a little-known ruin on the fringes of the then-known world to an important contributor to the classical revival. Our interaction with the city transformed from an academic curiosity into a place steeped in the popular imagination, becoming a paragon of neoclassical taste that paved the way for its significance today. If we wind the clock back to the late 17th century, Palmyra remained beyond the bounds of the known antique world. It was only the forays of William Halifax, the chaplain to the Aleppo factory of the Levant Company, alongside two merchants, Aaron Goodger and Timothy Lanoy, that brought Palmyra back within the Western compass. Though they failed to explore the ruins thoroughly in 1678, ending up hostages within the ruins to the local emir, 1691 marked the first meaningful interaction with the ancient city, as the trio later published accounts of their voyage into the desert in the academic journal, Philosophical Transactions. The Dutch draftsman Gerard Hofstede van Essen accompanied them on the expedition. He recorded the first panorama of the ruins, which we can see above as an oil on canvas and below in the etching form as it was published with Halifax's article. The visual played a key role in the early reception of Palmyra, as visitors sought to add authority to their account by reproducing a view of the city, which often reflected their written itinerary. Despite their discovery and the subsequent arrival of first French and then Swedish travellers, interest remained within the academy until the publication of Robert Wood's Ruins of Palmyra in 1753. Wood travelled to Palmyra as part of a large antiquarian expedition in 1751, and as a result was one of the first dozen Westerners to see the site. With money behind the mission, James Jamaica Dawkins, an absentee plantation owner and slave trader in the Caribbean, and fellow Oxford graduate John Bouverie, who died en route, Theirs was the first serious contribution to Palmyrene studies, or more inquisitive examination into the ruins, as Wood coined it. Dawkins donated over £50,000 to the venture and its ensuing publications, Ruins of Palmyra in 1753 and Ruins of Baalbek 4 years later. In today's terms, this sum is equivalent to a figure in the region of £10 million. Prefixed with a historical account, a description of their voyage through the desert, and plan of Palmyra, the final publication contained 57 engravings. These engravings sparked the development of the Palmyrene taste, as draftsman Giovanni Battista Borra's published plates were transformed into spectacular stucco ceilings in a domestic setting for a dilettante audience hooked on novel design sources. At Stowe, Borra was responsible for the importation of patterns inspired by the South Addison of the Temple of Bel, which later fueled an architectural trend across the contemporary aristocracy. What started under Earl Temple at Stowe resurfaced at Woburn under the Duke of Bedford, before the founder of the Society of Dilettanti and former Chancellor of the Exchequer, Sir Francis Dashwood, commissioned a series of spectacular frescoes across his estate. West Wickham Park was stamped with the insignia of the Temple of the Sun, as the Temple of Bel was then known, which stretched from the entrance hall and dining room of the main house to the nave of St. Lawrence Church up on the hill. Yet, an interest in Palmyra did not remain an isolated concern within the gentry. Proof of the more popular demand for all things Palmyrene came at Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens in London, where the owner, Jonathan Tyers, launched a Palmyra-inspired illusionary installation as early as 1754. Here we can see the artwork as it was reproduced to fool punters into thinking that Palmyra's iconic colonnade was integrated into the Grand Walk as they toured the gardens. Boasting a diverse range of attendees, the garden's summer soirees attracted aristocrats to more middle-class folk, meaning that an awareness of the ruins filtered down from the upper echelons of society. We can see the effect of Wood's Ruins of Palmyra only a year after its release, as the illustrations permeated into popular culture and turned the ruins into a significant tributary of the classical revival. I hope you can get a sense already for the movement away from archaeology as a primary research tool and into the disciplines of art, publication, and cultural history. The topos of inquiry pivots from the site to the site of the ruins. My research focalizes how the ruins are dislocated from their material location and bleed into popular consciousness as a result. I investigate how Palmyra exists in the collective imagination, which, in a way, takes the actual existence of the ruins out of the equation. They are the launchpad for my work, which then explores individual episodes in the reception of the ruins, such as the publication of the book or an illusionary artwork. When combined, the cumulative effect of each episode helps to build an impression of Palmyra's legacy for the West. This is not a narcissistic reflection or celebration of Western Orientalism, but can have real-world consequences when applied to Palmyra's future. I believe this has become all the more important with the destruction on site and in light of the potential reconstruction of the city. We need to understand how the place of Palmyra has come to occupy such an important position politically and what that means for our understanding of the ancient city. Western journalists, commentators, and even academics do not necessarily appreciate the ruins for their unique art and architecture or the crucible of civilization that the oasis made possible at Palmyra, but only the outrage of iconoclasm. Islamic State militants destroyed something that was classical, something that was ours, something that was recognized to be Roman or European. For these critics, Palmyra exists more in the popular imagination than it does in the Syrian steppe. Their views are the product of many chapters of Western interaction with the city that culminate in this political and cultural possession of space and place. The white noise masks the reality. But when we lament the loss of Palmyra, it cannot be in the haze of history, because the future of the site will have major repercussions, ranging from geopolitical relations to the legitimacy of authoritarian regimes, through to the local residents who have begun to return to the modern city of Tadmor. Delving into the archives of centuries of Palmyra's history can help inform, understand, and critique arguments today. A recent exemplar is the Institute of Digital Archaeology's 3D printed reconstruction of the Arch at Palmyra that has been paraded around the globe. From Trafalgar Square to New York, Dubai to Arona in Italy, the arch continues its restless voyage to this day, popping up in Switzerland just last year. Hailed by its creators as a precise facsimile of the arch destroyed in the summer of 2015, it is in fact anything but. The response to the arch provides a template for the ways in which classical reception, critical heritage studies, and archaeology can combine to shape modern debates and influence future policy. The issue around the arch was the disjuncture between the rhetoric and the reality. While the arch was spun by executive director Roger Michel as a detailed recreation on a par with the original, its quality instantly found critics. Chief among them was the Madrid-based Factum Foundation, who work in digital archaeology and 3D printing themselves. An article published on their website lambasted the lack of architectural detail in the arch, the colour, the size, and the structure itself, referring to this as a collection of bars of soap on top of each other. Divorced from its direct archaeological context, lacking the three arches linking the lateral colonnades, the IDA arch had little overlap with the structure it purported to replicate. Rather than showcasing the potential of 3D printing to reconstruct destroyed structures on an industrial scale, it in fact revealed the limitations of the technology at the IDA's disposal. Yet, none of the above stopped Michel from claiming that rematerialization through such printing technology could be achieved on site, telling the BBC that the idea would be to install 3D printing grids on a site near to Palmyra, to use the same cutting tool technology on location in Palmyra, which will provide jobs for local people. He later stated that the whole project could be completed within 6 months, leaving the ruins completely indistinguishable from the original. What could have been an admirable awareness-raising project which placed Palmyra's demise front and centre became part of a neo-colonialist power grab to rewrite the future of the site. At this juncture, I believe it is crucial that academics, experts from relevant industries and stakeholders, both local and international, come together to help inform such discussions. Michel's God complex cannot be cast aside as the ravings of a megalomaniac set on eradicating any authenticity at Palmyra in favour of the Disneyfication of the ruins. The project was supported by Oxford and Harvard universities, which gave academic kudos to this vanity project. Since 2016, the academic community has united to critique the IDA's misplaced initiative, and the media storm around the arch has subsequently dissolved. The attempt to rebuild the ruins of Palmyra, as they were perceived by a Western audience, is potentially toxic. The ruins we could visit a decade ago were a desert fantasy rebuilt and amended by French archaeologists in the early 20th century. The arch itself remained standing due to the engineering work conducted by French missions of the 1920s, which installed steel rods to strengthen the antique structure and rebuilt arch elements, as we can see here. If Palmyra is to rise again, we have to learn the lessons of the past and value local stakeholders and ask for insight from the returning population of Tadmor. 100 years ago, the solution was simply to build a new town, displace the locals who lived within the Temple of Bel throughout the Ottoman period, and remove their footprint from the ruins. I have argued elsewhere that the protection of the unique local ecology of the desert oasis needs to be incorporated into any future plans. Learning from past mistakes is one way in which we can avoid turning Palmyra into a Disneyland rather than an authentic ancient site alongside an inhabitable settlement. I firmly believe classical reception and critical heritage studies can help archaeology and its practitioners maintain relevance even when they are sidelined as at Palmyra. Excavation can be conducted into archival material and other relevant databases to continue research and help shape the future of sites otherwise out of reach. Whether it is a thesis like mine through to more frontline skills which help salvage something from the devastation on site, collaboration will help avoid irreparable loss and possible oblivion for cultural heritage sites under threat in the 21st century. Thank you for your time.
Okay, hi everyone. So yes, as I said, my research I'm going to present today is using experimental archaeology to better understand the ways in which recycling affects the chemistry and workability of glass. Just a little bit of context, so this is part of my wider PhD project, which is specifically looking at early medieval glass recycling practices in England, and trying to provide a more nuanced and interesting view of recycling than the one that we sometimes currently have, which tends to view all recycling in a very similar way and sort of approaches it all from either the prospect of sort of providing an economic advantage or being the product of scarcity of materials, and there's kind of no nuance in between that. But yeah, so today I'm going to present the sort of experimental. Was designed to answer three primary questions. The first of which is, how does the chemical composition of glass change with repeated recycling? The second is, how does repeated recycling affect the workability of glass? And this aspect is really crucial, because then can begin to let us think about how these factors might have affected the technological and decision-making practices of glassworkers in antiquity. So one of the key things that I wanted to do was to not just approach this from the point of view of the glass chemistry, but to actually understand how it's affecting the workability of the glass. Because ultimately that's what glass workers in antiquity would know. They would know how the glass is changing. So this would be something that would actually be relevant to the people who were working glass in the past. And that's what I really wanted to get at. So there are several ways in which we think that recycling might alter the chemical composition of glass, either in terms of contamination or loss. The effects from burning of wood fuel. So wood fuel we assume is going to introduce potash, phosphates, magnesia and calcium into the glass. There could also be some degree of interaction with the walls of the crucible, a chemical reaction between the clay of the crucible and the glass patch itself, which could theoretically introduce magnesia and iron oxide. And finally, in terms of things that might contaminate the batch, we have oxidation scale from the blowing iron, which could introduce iron oxide, unsurprisingly. We also need to think about what could maybe be lost during reheating. So there's a common assumption that you're going to be losing alkali, the flux, the thing that kind of works, being able to blow it as sort of being if you just melted silica on its own, you'd end up with something that was unworkable. It'd just be like kind of toffee. So in this case, we're going to be talking about soda or sodium. And there's an assumption this is going to be driven off due to the high temperatures and repeated recycling cycles. But you could also be losing other volatiles, including things such as chlorine. So archaeologists studying ancient glass recycling have made several assumptions which underlie much of the current ideas about how much glass recycling was going on in the past and what that recycling looks like chemically. So first of all, the glass becomes rapidly unworkable with repeated recycling without the input of fresh glass. This assertion is often cited without reference, but is largely based on anecdotal evidence from modern studio glassworkers who are working with electric and gas-fired furnaces, employing high, stable temperatures. Secondly, that this deterioration in the workability of glass is a result of two primary factors. First, significant loss of flux, or sodium, resulting from increased glass viscosity. And second, contamination coming from wood fuel by potassium, phosphorus, magnesium, and calcium. And finally, there's an assumption that the rate of contamination or loss with repeated recycling is consistent and that could be used to quantify rates of recycling in the past. However, the veracity and applicability of these assumptions to ancient glass recycling has never been tested previously. So experimental archaeology provides the only means of directly testing these assumptions. Although several reconstruction furnaces have been built and run over the last decade, the very few experiments designed to understand recycling have been confined to the lab. So my work sought to be the first to empirically test the effects of recycling on the chemical composition and, as I said, very crucially, also the working properties of glass using a period-appropriate furnace structure, and most crucially, using wood fuel as a heat source. So a baseline glass of known composition was produced, against which changes in chemical composition and working properties with increased recycling could be measured. Pure laboratory reagents were used, and the batch was melted using an electric laboratory furnace to prevent any contamination entering the glass prior to the first recycling cycle. And the composition of this glass was based on a glass compositional grouping, which was a sort of very most common glass grouping in the period in which most of my research takes place, but is also very similar compositionally to Roman glass. So the furnace replicated the small furnace design that was used by Taylor and Hill, who did some reproduction of Roman glass furnaces. This had the advantage of the associated publication containing detailed information about construction methods, resource usage, both in terms of construction and firing regimes, as well as detailed plans and section drawings to draw from. So my experiments weren't about, testing new designs for furnaces, so it made sense to use one that I already knew worked. The furnace was constructed using a daub of heavily grogged stoneware clay and roughly 30% by volume of straw. The firing chamber and siege supports used vermiculite fire bricks, and the bricks inside the firing chamber were given a sacrificial skin of daub to help protect them from the direct heat of the fire. The siege was constructed using 2 high temperature fire tiles. The experiment ran for a total of 5 days, 24 hours per day. So it's in order to make a most efficient use of the fuel and also to prevent sort of thermal shock to the furnace from having to let it cool and then reheat every day. You have to keep this thing going all the time during the period in which you're running the experiments. I will say that this was an extremely exhausting process. I did not have quite as many helpers as I was originally hoping for. So there were several rather sleepless nights involved in this research. So the experiment ran for 5 days, 24 hours per day, during which the glass was recycled 5 times. And for the purposes of reproducibility, the experiment was run twice overall, so 2 sets of 5 days of experimentation. So henceforth, these will be referred to as Experiment A and Experiment B. A fresh batch of raw glass and a new crucible were utilised for each repeat to ensure there was no cross-contamination between the glass from Experiment A to Experiment B. The wood used was a mixture of hardwood species. So the furnace was charged with 500 grams of raw glass on the first day of each experiment. On each following day, the glass was then removed from the furnace after being held at between 900 to 1100 degrees C for 12 hours. Temperatures were logged every 15 minutes while the glass was inside the furnace. The glass was removed from the furnace in one of 2 ways. On days 1, 3 and 5 of each week, the glass was worked by a professional glass worker to assess the workability of the glass and any changes in working properties associated with recycling. On days 2 and 4, I removed the glass from the furnace myself, and no formal workability assessment was made. The glass was then broken up into chunks, weighed, and a small fragment was taken for chemical analysis, and then the furnace was charged again with recycled glass. The information provided by workability assessments adds a vital additional dimension to the understanding the effects of recycling on glass that's not accessible through chemical analysis alone, in a way that would have been significantly more applicable and meaningful to glassworkers in antiquity. The combination of workability data with the record of changing chemical composition with increased recycling enables us to make stronger links to craftsperson experience and decision-making practices when discussing recycling in the past. Workability was assessed using a combination of workability scores and commentary on the experience of working with glass provided by an experienced modern glassworker. Collection of workability in the field requires specialist expert understanding and experience of glass and glassworking. Changes in working properties can be subtle and can be affected by a range of variables, so understanding of these factors is really vital to ensure the information collected is reliable. To this end, I work with Colin Rennie from the University of Sunderland, a specialist in glass blowing and hot glass working based at the National Glass Centre. Workability scores were awarded for 3 criteria, definitions of which are up here now, so softness, homogeneity and length. Each criterion was scored on a relative scale of 1 to 10, where 10 would be a typical modern studio glass that was familiar to the glassworker, with ideal, and it's key here to stress this is ideal as judged by a modern studio glassworker, homogeneity, working length and softness. 2 tests were used to assess the working property criteria. These were pulling a cane, So this was judged by the ease, width and length to which a cane could be pulled using one smooth continuous pulling motion, and blowing a vessel that was modelled on a simple palm cup. An effort was made to ensure the vessels were blown in a similarly sized gather each time to ensure a comparability between tests. So this graph shows the percentage difference from the raw glass for a total of 5 elements: sodium, magnesium, phosphorus, potassium and calcium, across each of the 5 days of the experiment for experiment B. As might be predicted, there is an increase seen in both phosphorus and potassium over the 5 days, whilst there is a decrease in sodium. However, it is noticeable that the percentage difference in sodium between the raw glass and the glass on day 5 is only -6%, so really very small. In terms of relative effect on composition, phosphorus is the element most affected by recycling in experiment B. The percentage difference in phosphorus between the baseline and day 5 is +75%, with a steady increase across all 5 days of the experiment. Likewise, there is a fairly consistent increase in potassium observable in experiment B, though the relative increase in the element is smaller than that of phosphorus, amounting to a total increase of potassium of +19% by day 5 of the experiment. For both magnesium and calcium, recycling seemed to make little difference. A pattern similar to that of experiment B can be observed in experiment A, whereby the elements most clearly affected by recycling are phosphorus, potassium and sodium, with an overall decrease in sodium and again increases in both phosphorus and potassium. However, the increases in both phosphorus and potassium are in general much smaller than in experiment B, with a notable exception that I'll discuss in a minute. However, in experiment A, a large increase in magnesium can be seen on day 5 of +43%, and this correlates with similar significant increases in phosphorus of +125% and potassium of +110%, and a decrease, interestingly, in calcium of -20%. What is particularly notable consistency during experiments A and B is that once again the concentrations of sodium, whilst demonstrating an overall decrease, show relatively little change from the baseline, including the samples from day 5, which demonstrate significant changes in all other elements. So these next set of graphs show for both experiments A and B the workability scores that were awarded for the recycled glass. The scores and overall trends across the 3 days are largely very consistent between experiment A and B. Both glass softness and length increased between day 1 and day 3, with then a slight decrease again in the scores for both of these properties on day 5. Whilst homogeneity either increased over time in experiment A or remained consistent from days 3 to 5 in experiment B. The low scores on day 1 are attributable to a high degree of bubbles in the glass as a result of the raw glass having been too finely crushed before being added to the crucible. And adjusting for this, the results would otherwise look very similar to those on day 3. The agreement between experiment A and B in terms of overall trends suggests that the actual effect of recycling upon workability was largely consistent between the 2 experiments. This is particularly notable given that experiment B demonstrated generally higher degrees of contamination than experiment A, with the exception of that extraordinarily high level of contamination on day 5 in A, which might have been expected to overall result in lower scores. This suggests that the working properties of glass are not strongly affected by the input of relatively small amounts of contamination by potassium or phosphorus, and that the relative lack of loss of flux in both experiments is probably key to the consistency and workability. Whilst, of course, there remains a degree of subjectivity involved in the scoring system, it was designed to provide a framework for consistency and replicability in the glassworkers' observations and to allow semi-quantitative analysis of workability. Although these scores don't represent absolute values, they can give us a systematic way of assessing relative changes in working properties with increased recycling. So let's revisit those assumptions that I said were underpinning much of the way that we currently think about glass recycling in the archaeological past when we look at chemical composition. So first, the idea that glass becomes rapidly unworkable for repeated recycling. Well, although recycling does have some effect upon the workability of glass, the glass in fact remained very workable even after 5 cycles of closed loop recycling. and the rate of change after the initial remelting cycle of day 1 is in fact only very slight. This is contrary to suggestions made of a rapid deterioration of glass quality and workability with increased recycling, largely based on anecdotal evidence from modern glass workers. Changes in workability with recycling would likely not have been especially notable to individual glass workers who would already have been used to working with much more variable compositions and conditions than modern studio glass workers. And any changes that may have occurred would most likely have been rather gradual over a lifetime or perhaps even several generations. Over which these kind of changes were occurring. So most people would probably not have been actually able to necessarily pick up on a distinct change in workability with recycling. The idea that there is a significant loss of flux during recycling, second of all, I think can also be refuted. These experiments showed that very little sodium was lost, with a maximum change from the baseline of only -6%. Even when heavy contamination was present, the rate of loss of sodium was consistent. The impact of losing such a small amount of flux on workability appears to be pretty much negligible. Contamination by wood fuel was the most obvious impact of recycling upon the glass, although even this was relatively small in terms of actual values. However, most of the contamination came from phosphorus and potassium. There was actually very little change in the values of magnesium and calcium, contrary to what is usually assumed. Where the impact of magnesium upon the glass composition was seen, it was only accompanied by extremely high contamination by potassium and phosphorus. It is possible that this reflected a difference in contamination by combustion vapours versus direct contamination by ash. And finally, the idea that the rate of contamination or loss is consistent and could be used to quantify recycling in the past. I think this idea is really problematic. The rate of contamination is pretty variable across experiment A and B, despite them being performed under as close to the exact same conditions as possible. Experiment A also demonstrates the potential for large spikes in contamination, possibly resulting from direct contamination by ash. These results clearly demonstrate that attempts to quantify past recycling using wood fuel contamination would be problematic, particularly given the complications of potential mixed cullet sources and addition of fresh glass. However, general trends towards higher degrees of contamination across a particular object type, site, or chronological period could still be taken as indicative of more intensive recycling practices. So overall, these findings are made more robust when we consider this is essentially what you might call a worst case scenario for recycling, where glass has been repeatedly recycled within a completely closed system with no influx of fresh unrecycled glass, essentially allowing for a maximum likelihood of contamination by wood fuel and loss of flux. So these experiments have demonstrated some of our key assumptions underlying our interpretation of past glass recycling practices are either likely to incorrect or too simplistic. It is very likely that significantly more recycling was going on in the past than might be predicted by our current models. And much recycling is likely to be chemically invisible, particularly in situations where regular influxes of fresh glass were utilised alongside recycled material. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone, my name is Alette Blom, and I am here to talk about my PhD research, which takes a multidisciplinary approach to reconstructing the lived experience of English medieval Hansen's disease and leprosy sufferers. So leprosy is quite a well-known disease that is referred to in the medical field as Hansen's disease. The condition is an infectious disease caused by Mycobacterium lepra, or more rarely by Mycobacterium lepromatosis. The bacterium prefers skin temperatures and thus most often and initially infects the nose, ears, fingers, and toes. The condition develops into a slow and chronic infection that causes nerve damage and a subsequent loss of sensation. This loss of sensation then often leads to cuts and abrasives going unnoticed and remaining uncleaned, through which a secondary infection can infiltrate the body. Now, contrary to what many people believe, the severity of the disease is very much dependent on your immune status, and the disease is not as easily transmitted as is often assumed. Additionally, the disease carries a huge social stigma in many cultures and societies, both in the past and today. Please be warned that the next slide contains the image of an individual with very severe Hansen's disease lesions if you're uncomfortable with that. Because of the combination of all of these factors, the condition can cause severe disability and disfigurement, as can be seen here. And likely because of this, it is one of the oldest known diseases to affect humankind. But despite this deep history and freely available treatment, it still takes place every 2 to 3 minutes. Effects of the eradication efforts.
I think you've frozen, Alette. That could be a connection issue. Oh, there you are.
Yeah.
There you go. Thank you.
Where did I fall away?
Can you just do the previous slide again, just in case?
Oh,
there. Thank you.
This one. Yeah. Because of this combination of factors, the condition can cause severe disability and disfigurement, as can be seen here. Likely because of this, this is one of the oldest diseases known to affect humankind. But despite this deep history and freely available medication and treatment, the disease still causes a new infection every 2 to 3 minutes. Effects of the eradication efforts by the World Health Organization have halted in the last decades, and the new number of infections has stayed steady over several years. Part of this is attributed to the superstitions and stigma that prevent people
I'll let you frozen again.
Oh, there you are, Alette. Sorry.
I've not had this before.
Oh, don't worry, don't worry. We're all used to Zoom now. Not a problem at all, and we've got plenty of time, so don't worry at all.
This screen. Unfortunately, I can't know when I'm lost. So,
Yeah, of course.
Which is the last thing that you guys heard me say?
It was the bit about the stigma from the World Health Organization.
Okay, yeah.
That second bullet point.
Okay. So why do we have this stigma? The main attributing factor is that the disease is very recognizable and causes very severe lesions that have a huge impact on how someone can still lead their lives. Additionally, though, mistranslations between Arabic, English, and Latin medical and religious texts have caused confusion about what exactly causes the disease. And this is further aggravated by bombastic interpretations in 19th and 20th century historic texts. So these modern mistranslations of the disease have led to an overly negative image of the disease, which is still often referred to in scientific publications as being caused by immorality. It is important to note, however, that what we refer to as a Mycobacterium leprae infection cannot be used synonymous with the term leprosy in historic writing. The term leprosy much more likely referred to any number of skin diseases and a multitude of disfigurements and disabilities. It is this biblical leprosy that was believed to be caused by moral sin and required punishment by God. What we can say, however, is that the medieval descriptions of leprosy likely included what we now call an M. leprae infection. It is also this biblical leprosy that is frequently portrayed in imagery and very strongly influences how we see the disease today. But such negative images have overshadowed the situation in which these individuals might have actually lived. Historic research in the last 2 decades, piloted by François Taouti and Carol Rawcliffe, have focused on reassessing this history and have shown that the lives of individuals may have unraveled quite differently after diagnosis based on your status, sex, gender, status, and most importantly, personal choice. This suggests that there may have actually been a substantial amount of variation in the lives of sufferers. Unfortunately, historic records of individuals focus most frequently on the rare and elite cases, and these records rarely follow an individual throughout their entire life. Bioarchaeology offers us the opportunity to corroborate or disprove this written history, largely because, as many people here will know, the field studies the actual material and remain of past ordinary people. So far, however, this research has largely focused on individuals and individual sites, and ADNA research has largely focused on pathologically recognizable cases. Moreover, the field has not seen many holistic and comparative analyses of the British archaeological population with Hansen's disease. So when we look at the paleopathology of this specific disease, Mycobacterium lepra infection can actually leave a mark, which is not the case for every disease that we know. But only 3 to 5% of people who have the disease develop skeletal lesions that we can recognize in the archaeological record. Rhinomaxillary syndrome is the best indicator of the disease and is most often used to diagnose archaeological cases. Now, ADNA can help us to further identify these potential cases that might not show skeletal lesions, but we have to be aware that being infected with Mycobacterium lepra does not necessarily mean you have the disease, which is the same we're seeing with COVID now. You can carry it, but may not necessarily feel ill or feel sick. So just another warning, the next 3 slides will contain images of human remains. Here we can see an example of this severe rhinomaxillary syndrome in which the nasal floor, maxillary alveolar bone, and palate have been completely absorbed by infection, creating a large oral nasal area. The hands, most lesions in the hands are caused by this secondary infection that infiltrates to cuts and abrasions and can cause hand bones to become relatively thin and whittle away, as we can see here. In the feet, this process is often worse because people tend to walk on their feet a lot, and so there are more cuts and abrasions into which dirt can come. And this can lead to a near complete loss of toes or feet. As we can see here, most of the toes have actually disappeared. So my PhD aims to contribute to this paleopathological and bioarchaeological research by taking another look at the skeletons that have been excavated in the last few decades. Now, the skeleton holds within it imprints of health and disease that have occurred throughout life, and these are reflected in different sorts of biological information that we can reconstruct. So, for example, a macroscopic analysis of human skeletal remains can provide us with information about age, sex, and disease. Isotopic analysis of carbon and nitrogen of teeth can provide information about childhood diet, while isotopic analysis of ribs can provide information about diet in the last 10 years of life. A comparison between this early and late life diet can give us insight into changes during life when it comes to diet, and these may possibly be caused either by institutionalization or by a change in socioeconomic status. Genetic data, lastly, can confirm biological sex and infection with Mycobacterium lepra, whether the disease is skeletally visible or not. Social circumstance, however, is equally important. So complementary to the bioarchaeological data, the burial location and context of individuals can reveal information about its social setting. For example, we have archaeological cases of sufferers of Hansen's disease who live in leprosaria or specifically designed hospitals for individuals suffering leprosy. But we also have evidence of sufferers who are living in friary or parish cemeteries. And this may reflect that individuals actually have a choice in whether they are institutionalized or not. Moreover, we can look at the burial ritual, grave goods, and locations within a cemetery to understand whether there are differences between individuals and their circumstances. All this archaeological data is valuable, but it becomes even more valuable when we combine it. The life course approach can complement, or rather help us structure, all the archaeological data along a timeline scale. As Hansen's disease is a disease with an incredibly complex etiology, it helps us to understand both the biological and cultural attributes of each individual that is infected. The life course approach aims to understand how different influences, such as early life health, socioeconomic status, diet, and disease can impact life outcome, and how each of these factors can, in their own turn, introduce other influences such as institutionalization. Although it may seem that archaeology offers relatively little insight into this concept, as all we look at is the palimpsest of life in the skeleton, we can untangle and structure all these individual data points and get them in a chronological order. This is possible due to an overlap between when life events actually occurred and which periods of life can be reconstructed using archaeological methods. Through this means, we can sequentially understand the person behind their skeleton and each individual life course. So my PhD will take two large approaches. Firstly, the life course approach, as I've just talked about, will reveal the individual and can highlight differences between pre- and post-institutionalization. Secondly, a comparative approach will allow an assessment of populations and differences between institutions and communities. Combined, these data will allow us, combined with historic records, to reconstruct the lived experience of people in the past and what it must have been like to suffer this condition. This is a novel approach being increasingly used in clinical and epidemiological contexts to understand the long-term impact of disease and its relationship to social variables. When we do this for a large enough group of individuals from a variety of sites, we can understand the variation that existed in an entire population. And this data can then be used to understand the social and biological precursors and consequences of an infection with Mycobacterium lepra. So the aim of my PhD is to reconstruct the actual individual lives of leprosy patients in medieval England. In order to achieve this aim, I will be looking at material from 6 possible leprosarium sites and 15 non-leprosaria sites, including friaries and parish cemeteries. These sites will span the Anglo-Saxon to medieval period to see if there's actually a difference that is introduced by medieval ideas. And it will span most of England, although I have a focus on the southeast due to the fact that that's where most sites are. Now, I don't really have very much preliminary data, which is very unfortunate, but COVID has hit my research quite hard because I haven't yet had access to very many of my collections. But what I can say is that we've had positive DNA results for 2 sites where we did not yet have any confirmation that they were leprosaria. And we have positive aDNA results from individuals without any diagnostic lesions, which means that there are actually individuals in the archaeological record that we have thus far been unable to assess. And lastly, historic records have actually revealed a huge amount of variability in that sometimes it's just rich people who buy their place into a leprosarium just to live more comfortably, for example. And that was it. I want to thank my supervisors, advisory team, ancient DNA collaborators, and collection curators and contacts, and all funding bodies that are involved in my PhD. Thank you very much.
That was brilliant. Thank you. Fascinating. It's interesting. I live opposite quite an old church, and when we first moved here, we had a tour of it, and they showed us the leper squint that they called it.
Oh.
Which was, I hadn't seen one before. So it was just a very small room and just a very small kind of slot where anybody that was kind of ostracized from, you know, whether they had leprosy or not, could view the service where they didn't have to mingle with anybody else. So,
well, that's very interesting. Where is that?
It's in Leicestershire. So
okay.
I can send you the details for it. But yeah, I think they are relatively common, but I think there is some debate as to their actual role. But yeah, that was quite fascinating. But anyway, sorry, I digress, but that was fascinating. Thank you ever so much. So moving on to our next speaker, Stephanie from the University of Southampton. And this presentation is Are You Sitting Comfortably? A Disability Story from the Romano-British Cemetery at Alington Avenue, Dorset. Thank you very much.
That was, this ties in well, I think, with Alette's talk just then. So I'm really excited that I'm able to follow on from you. That was a really great talk, and I have questions we should talk. But anyway, my own stuff. In my PhD, which I've just submitted, I look at disability in the Roman world, specifically Roman Britain, through the study of skeletal remains. Just a wee bit of admin before I start. As I study human remains, there will be photographs of human remains on the slides as we go through, just a warning if that worries people. Like Alette, I try to go beyond diagnosis and identification of individuals to gain insight into a lived experience in a social and physical environment. And to do this, I try to integrate data. So I want to integrate my data I've collected from human skeletons together with archaeological, historical, anthropological, and clinical insights to try and get as complete image as I possibly can. But this integration can be challenging. And one way that has helped this integration process is by writing fictive narratives. This approach is inspired by the likes of Janet Spector, who wrote What This All Means, and Alexis Boutin. And they use fictive narratives as an alternative communication style for academic writing, because let's face it, sometimes academic writing can be a tad on the dry side. For me, fiction writing is also potentially more accessible, and this feels like a real key point and a key theme that I'm trying to address, especially when I'm talking about disability, as disability studies is embroiled in a fight for improved accessibility generally. It feels only right to try and participate in that. So today I want to present my own efforts in the fictive narrative communication style. There's a general worry that fictive narratives can be a bit of a just so story and wrongly portrayed as this is what happened. To address this, I try to incorporate transparency as much as possible. For example, the writing that I present to you today is one of three, looking at the same scene, but they are three different perspectives and three slightly different interpretations to try and get across that this is not the definite truth as some might consider. Also, along with my fictive narratives, there are footnotes, and those are what how I justify the present the evidence for the narrative that I've written. Today I'm going to be sharing a story that's narrated by this woman. I've just drawn some cartoons to help present the scenes that I've created. And this woman is attending a funeral in Roman Dorset. As she is in the procession, she is reflecting, and we hear her thoughts. She describes the scene and explained that she helped to prepare the body of the deceased, who had an arm amputation shortly before death. He sees him being buried in a face down position alongside his dog. So today I'm just going to read you a very short snippet, 2 paragraphs, just to give you the style and just sort of the kind of thing I presented, just the start of this story. If that is all, if you will indulge me briefly. So if you're sitting comfortably, I will begin. I wish they would slow down a bit, even as the solemn procession carefully picks its way across the increasingly uneven ground of the necropolis. I still feel like I'm trotting to keep up. I have to jump out of the way of a swinging elbow, a persistent hazard when you are at this height. Being invisible to people, however, is preferable to their stares. Strangers unashamedly scrutinize my small stature, my large hands, my strange gait, my prominent backside, whispering behind their hands. I feel self-conscious, but I act defiant. I once heard a stranger in the market say that they would expose me at birth if they'd had a child like me. What kind of future could she possibly have? I still wonder about my future. I'm still young, but will I ever find someone to marry? I once saw a bronze statue of the goddess Minerva at Aqua Solis. In the dense crowds, I struggled to get a view until I was directly in front of her. I ran my hands over the lettering on the base. The statue's beautiful proportioned grace was perfection. Next to her, my hands looked strangely large, as my forearms are so small. Even bronze clothing clings and cascades down her figure in a way real fabric just does not on me. My bottom sticks out, making my dresses sit funny on my body. I saw that statue and thought, that is not me. I will never be like that. So now I'm going to present some of the footnote evidence that goes along with the narrative. I'm going to introduce you to AA766, who is the narrator of that piece. She's the skeleton of a female who died at about 18 to 20 years old, and she was about 4 foot in stature, which is about 1.23 m at full growth. She has a type of dwarfism, which is called Langer type mesomeilic dwarfism. I tried to incorporate the spellings in the yellow just in case. This form of dwarfism is disproportionate in that it affects the forearms and the shin bones more so than the upper arms and the thigh bones. And so hence she talks about her very short forearms, and it makes her hands look large. She also talks about having a prominent backside, and this is called by something called lumbar hypolordosis, which does cause a curvature of the spine and is sometimes related with this form of dwarfism, and it would cause a bit of a booty, like I think Kim Kardashian would be very pleased with. She talks about getting married. In Roman Britain, the youngest bride we have evidence for epigraphically was 19. And this is much later than we know from Rome and the central Mediterranean. So it would seem that dying between the ages of 18 and 20, she was on the cusp of marriageability. So something in the imminent future, but maybe not quite there yet. And marriage was also seen as a key life course stage for Roman women, which is why it's mentioned here. She briefly alludes to exposure and the infanticide issue. The idea that evidently disabled children when they were born were unwanted. And I think this is a popular perception in today that the Roman world could be nasty, brutish and short, and that particularly so for disabled people. Infanticide definitely has dominated disability discourse. And whilst there is some evidence that it happened, we have no idea to what extent. So in Roman Britain, for example, there is evidence of a site at Hambledon, hotly contested evidence about what this site represents, but 97 newborn infants have been found at that site, and that is thought to have been indications of infanticide. What I can say about this issue is limited. All I can tell you is AA766 was notably different at birth. The dwarfism is evident at birth, but she survived. And it would have been a theme people would have known about. So pictured on the screen is Romulus and Remus, that very famous sort of tableau of them being suckled by the she-wolf. And so it's that they were having to be brought up by a she-wolf because they themselves were exposed. So it's kind of part of the founding myth of Rome is this process. And this kind of imagery was found on coinage in Roman Britain. So we know it's at least something people knew happened. She talks about an encounter with a statue. In my head, statuary has always acted a bit like airbrushed magazines, and that most of them, the vast majority, show the idealized male or female body. And Lisa Trenton, the work of Lisa Trenton, describes how statuary is something people are invited to self-compare with. In Roman Britain, there is limited evidence of statuary still remaining, but there is some. So on the right on your screen is an example from Woodchester of a figure of Diana or Luna, depending on who you talk to. But the one she is looking at in the narrative is the one from Sulis Aquasulis, the famous Minerva head from Bath. This bust is thought to have been part of a full-size statue. And there is a direct road that links Dorchester, the local town, to the burial site that she was found in, links Dorchester to Bath. And we know Bath had an empire-wide reputation, not just Roman Britain-wide. The reactions that she had to the statuary, I was really fortunate to be able to chat to someone, we'll call her Jay today, who has grown to a similar height. She's about 4 foot, and she was able to give me a lot of insight of what that's like. So the incident where she ducks out the way of a swinging elbow, that's directly from her. And the insight with clothing not fitting, that's also from her. And I really like that that is not me. I will never be like that. That's pretty much a verbatim quote from her. And it gave me real insight into how someone has responded to being of a similar type to AA766. They are attending a burial. She's going on a burial procession and they're going to bury this guy. This is AA852. And this is where a lot of the creativeness has come from, because we have no idea if AA852 died before AA766 or vice versa. So this is where the creativity comes in. They definitely had a right arm amputation shortly before death. There's no evidence of healing, so it likely in the process killed him. The cause of death, the cause of the necessitation of this amputation is likely medical. There is evidence that punitive arm amputation limitedly occurred in the Roman world, but usually they just want to take a hand or a foot because they did want you to survive it. And this is right up on the upper arm of the right arm. And we also know that the Romans were capable of this kind of amputations. In fact, the amputation procedure suggested by Celsus is sound by modern standards, so they could do it. But it was risky because naturally they didn't have the anesthetics, the painkillers and stuff that we have today. And it's clear that this person, this adult male, did not survive the process. We mentioned in the narrative of the uneven ground. This is because the site that AA852 was buried at was surrounded by Bronze Age earthworks, so it would have existed at the time that they were being buried. And this is a common thing for the Romans to do, is to adopt sites that have already been used for their own purposes. I would argue that they likely carried the man on a bier and then placed him in a coffin on site, because coffins can weigh 200 kilograms without a body. And we don't know what way they're coming from on this map to show you where we are heading towards, but we have no idea what direction we're coming from. One of the reasons I set it at the funeral, the burial ground itself, is that we don't know if the population were rural or urban, so it neatly sidesteps that issue if we set it in a funeral. But we can see the grey on the map is all earthworks. So whatever angle you're coming from, they are reaching some uneven ground. The burial next to older monuments, as I said, is not an unusual thing to do, and it's likely to create a connection with older ancestors. It's establishing that connection, and that's a strong argument in the light of Dorset, because they did have a continuous burial right there, and so Iron Age burials were found here too, as well as Roman Britain. So they were definitely connected to this landscape, if you will. This is AA852 in situ, as they were found. The narrative describes the man being buried face down. As he was carried on a bier, that was a deliberate choice. Prone burial is usually interpreted as an example of necrophobia or fear of that dead person, as we've seen in anthropological examples, particularly in circumstances related to violent death. And in this case, we can assume that this was unexpected, traumatic death. He seems to be rather crammed into a small space, and he was quite a tall guy. And he was buried with a small dog. It wasn't a lap dog, but it was not big enough for hunting either. It's sort of in between height, about knee height. There's a lot of contention of what dogs in burials mean, but we can see in this photograph that the dog's paw is in direct contact with his ankle. So it's quite a cute little image, really, in my opinion. In this narrative, it's interpreted as his pet. In other narratives, there is more of a votive sacrifice element considered. Or was he supposed to be sort of a guard dog, making sure this potentially malevolent spirit didn't return? Was he a guide dog trying to deliver, make sure he's led to where he needs to go? As dogs in versions of Cerberus, but also in other mythologies, had that strong connection to the afterlife. So this is the kind of thing that I've been working on. I hope to have given you a flavour of that today. And I would be really grateful for any feedback of what you think of it. But I thank you very much for your time. And I would like to acknowledge the people on the screen.
And we're back for the second half of our academic, celebrating academic and early career research session. To start, we will have Summer from the University College London, who's going to talk about Tut on Tour, 60 years of demand creation through exhibition. So handing over to you, Summer.
Hello, my name is Summer. I'm a first-year PhD student at the Institute of Archaeology at UCL. For this presentation, I'm going to be introducing my doctoral research titled Tut on Tour, Demand Creation Through Exhibition, which aims to measure how blockbuster museum exhibits influence demand for antiquities on the market. The art and antiquities market is a multi-billion-dollar industry. The art and antiquities market generates exorbitant prices and high media attention, which results in archaeological material being reduced to commercial monetary value. Seen here are just a few examples of headlines for auction results, museum exhibits, and archaeological discoveries, all of which associate cultural heritage to monetary capital, profit, and status. Record sales and headlines like these help fuel market demand, which become an incentive for looting. The trade in illicit antiquities is a supply and demand transnational crime that employs complex networks that is motivated by end market consumers. These objects transition from artifact to loot to commodity and finally to collectible item, where they are imbued with social and monetary capital and are often removed from their original context. The prestige and profit associated with collecting motivate the market for antiquities, which cannot be separated into legal and illegal components, but is better described as what criminologists call a gray market, where seemingly legitimate actors and actions facilitate the trade of illegally acquired artifacts. Plainly said, the legal and legal market cannot exist without each other. Due to the opaque nature of the market, it is difficult to quantify the scale of the illicit market for antiquities. However, it is estimated that between 65 and 90% of antiquities offered for sale on the market have no clear published provenance, which suggests that a large and perhaps major portion of the market is comprised of illicit antiquities. This clearly indicates an immense threat to cultural heritage. So how do museums function within the market? Museums like to think of themselves as neutral entities on the periphery of the market, and while they do make up an overall small portion of buying power, they are arguably the most visible. Museums engage with the market through acquisition, the buying of objects, deaccession, the selling of objects, and through the donation of objects, which are then given a monetary value so that the donators can receive tax benefits. Despite viewing themselves as neutral third parties to the market, museums are active agents in the creation, enhancement, and normalization of demand for antiquities, which helps motivate the market. Museums imbue their collections with desirability through their authoritative influence, strategic display, storytelling, and commercialization of cultural heritage, which normalize and justify antiquity collecting. Corresponding with the multi-billion-dollar art market is the multi-million-dollar blockbuster industry. Blockbusters attract record crowds, which generate large sums of revenue. They are overtly commercial with large productions and marketing budgets, and regularly have major corporate sponsors. Hosting a successful blockbuster raises the profile and status of museums. As you can see from these photos, these events are increasingly popular, dramatic, interactive, and commercialized. This is best visualized by the well-presented gift shop, which both continues the museum experience and offers visitors the chance to own their very own Tut replica. This gift shop from the most recent Tut exhibit illustrates the intertwinement of museum display, blockbusters, and the market. And this begs the question, what are the consequences of this type of exhibit for museums, the market, and cultural heritage? There is an assumption among those who are engaged with the market that large-scale cultural events such as blockbusters guide collecting trends and inform the market to what is currently fashionable and profitable. However, at this time, there is only anecdotal evidence for this. What is really needed is long-term data to confirm such impressions. So attempting to tackle this need for long-term market data, this research is guided by 3 core questions. 1, do blockbuster exhibits influence demand for antiquities? If so, can this be measured? How long and how much do they influence demand? And what are the consequences of this demand creation? And how can museums more thoughtfully approach museum exhibits moving forward? This research stems from the hypothesis that blockbusters create, influence, enhance, and normalize demand for their subject matter. The aim of this research is to critique how blockbusters influence demand and measure its effect on the market in order to introduce reliable data to the critical debate concerning the relationship between museums, demand, and the antiquities market. So how do we measure demand for antiquities? My research design is a dual quantitative qualitative investigation using the original blockbuster, Tutankhamun, as the case study. In the last 6 years, Tut has been on 7 world tours and offers a well-documented long-term case study. This research investigates the antiquities market reaction to 60 years of Tut on tour by gathering and quantifying long-term auction sales data, collecting trends, price variations, and profit margins of Egyptian objects brought to auction. My quantitative data comes from Christie's, Sotheby's, Boehm's auction houses in London and New York. And my qualitative data comes from a combination of primary resources, targeted interviews, and reflexive observational fieldwork. By using a dual methodological approach, this study will measure, quantify, and contextualize the interrelationship between blockbusters and the market. So what does a study like this look like? Here I'm going to present a case study that made up my master's dissertation, which I completed last year, and serves as a foundation for my doctoral research. This case study examined the London antiquities market reaction to Treasures of Tutankhamun exhibit in the British Museum. The exhibit took place in 1972, celebrating the 50th anniversary of Tut's discovery, and included 50 hand-selected objects. Queen Elizabeth opened the exhibit personally on the 29th of March. The exhibit overall was a dramatic and memorable experience, exemplified by coming face to face with Tut's golden mask. The exhibition was a resounding success, with a record 1.6 million visitors, and it raised £8.9 million for the Philae Rescue Project, and heralded a wave of Tutmania in the UK. I think this quote from the Times encapsulates the effect of the exhibit quite well. Perhaps the greatest ambassador Egypt has ever sent abroad was Tutankhamun. The exhibition awakened millions of ordinary men and women in Britain and elsewhere to the magic of ancient Egypt. The keeper of the ancient Egypt at the British Museum reported that the exhibit certainly did an immense amount for the British Museum. Attendance increased dramatically, and it raised the museum's prestige with people in general. In my department alone, about £100,000 suddenly became available for new acquisitions. So while everyone else is enjoying Tutmania, what is the London art market doing? How are they reacting to Tut in town? So to measure market reaction to the exhibit, I collected and analyzed sales data from Christie's London between 1967 and 1977 to see if there was a quantifiable reaction to the market to the by the market to the exhibit. I identified 42 auctions that had Egyptian objects, which totaled 1,962 Egyptian lots. After analyzing the sales data, the results demonstrated a rapid and dramatic reaction to the market following the exhibit. This is followed by annual exponential growth of Egyptian object sales compared to pre-exhibit years. This figure shows the measurable market reaction to the exhibit. Sales of Egyptian objects in 1972 visibly skyrocket and outperform other years. The power of seeing and experiencing Tut's treasures in person results in quantifiable demand for Egyptian antiquities and results in exorbitant annual sales totals in 1972, followed by overall exponential growth, as seen in the yellow dots, in total sales. Historically, the art market between 1967 and 1971 was characterized as a booming and strong market for collecting. Yet Egyptian sales are noticeably lower up until 1972. And then after the exhibition, sales remained strong despite a global economic recession, oil crisis, and stock market crash. This figure illustrates Egyptian sales accounting for an increasingly significant portion of the overall market. Profits indicating a regressive sale in other antiquities categories. This shows that demand for antiquities are not universal, but selectively fixed towards Egyptian objects. One note, because of COVID lockdowns, I was unable to gather all the sales data for 1975, but I think the data still speaks for itself. Further analysis was performed, including resale value, collecting trends by object type, auction lot and frequency and profitability, as well as Egyptian object growth versus GDP. All results indicated the same conclusion, that there was a measurable and sustainable demand for Egyptian objects from 1972 onward. To contextualize my sales data, I surveyed the Times newspaper using keywords and dates within the study's timeframe. This survey revealed a surprising abundance of information about collecting trends, motivations for collecting. It identified buyers and described live auction interactions, including bidding wars, and so much more. I'm going to present here just a brief taste of the data garnered from the newspaper survey. So the Times consistently reported details and advice about the art market much before Tut came around. Charts with record sales, art as investment, and collecting trends and profits are seen here. Every auction resulted in an auction review reporting on noteworthy sales and market trends. Despite this strong tradition of reporting on the market, there were only 3 minor mentions of Egyptian objects at auction in the 5 years before the exhibit. This helps support the idea that collecting ancient Egypt was not fashionable or profitable before the exhibit, despite the overall strong art market. But 1 month after Tut opens, the Time writes, for those who are inspired by Tutankhamun's exhibit to begin their own ancient collection, there are 2 shows to help you start. There are several articles written that function as collecting guides, letting the reader know which auctions and dealers have antiquities for sales, indicating a strong market demand. Almost every auction review after Tut opens highlights demand for ancient Egyptian objects. The finale of the auction season is seen at the important Egyptian antiquities from the Temple of Mut auction, held at Christie's in December 1972. This auction received a half-page review and results in record sales. Quote, it was clearly a good year for selling Egyptian sculptures, with Tutankhamun lying in state at the British Museum, but Christie's price yesterday outstripped all hopes or expectations. This explicitly links demand to Tut's exhibit, while highlighting a strong year overall in Egyptian sales. News coverage for the 5 years after Tut are characterized by economic downturn and strong Egyptian sales. One of the first headlines in 1973 states, antiquities boom goes on as shares fall, reporting strong antiquity sales despite the stock market crash in early 1973. This is followed up by multiple examples of record Egyptian sales despite economic concerns. This one in 1974 states Egyptian figure sold for $357 2 years ago fetches $3,675 at Christie's. To quote it, not all Egyptian antiquities have multiplied 10 times in value in 2 years. There have been a notable increase in collecting interest, maybe because of the Tutankhamun exhibit. Yesterday's sale of antiquities was unusually crowded, and there was intense competition, especially for Egyptian pieces. Here we see that 2 years after the exhibit, Tut is still assumed to be inspiring collecting. Another interesting thing we learned in 1974 is the British Museum paid £4,725 for an Egyptian red quartz sphinx. So this acquisition by the British Museum offers an example of how the BM used its newly released funds after the successful exhibition by putting the money back into the market. In 1976, new records were set for Egyptian objects, despite a narrowing market for antiquities. Evidence presented in this preliminary case study support the hypothesis that blockbuster exhibits generate, influence, and enhance demand for antiquities. This research has several implications for museums and the market, particularly in a post-colonial, post-COVID world. Museums are active agents within the market, which can be seen here with these two headlines, both involving the Met. The one on the left, the now well-known case of the purchase and subsequent return of a looted golden mummy, which cost the museum $4 million and which they have not been compensated for. 2 years later, after COVID, the Met is now considering selling some of its collection to cover budget deficits. While the study may seem to bemoan museums, blockbuster exhibits, and our market, that is not the aim. This is a call to examine what motivates, justifies, and normalizes demand for antiquities. The object of this study is to introduce reliable data to the critical debate concerning the relationship between museum exhibits and market demand and the antiquities market. The study offers a foundation for understanding what creates demand in order to have a more proactive approach to combating the market for illicit antiquities. When Tut tours or the Terracotta Warriors or ancient Mayan treasures go on tour, if we understand that blockbuster exhibits generate demand, then resources, education, and international attention can be better applied to these regions before problems are created. Museum exhibits play an important role influencing demand, but they can also be active agents in educating the public about these issues. This research provides necessary reflections regarding the repercussions of current blockbuster exhibits. Today's society prioritizes transparent accountability, ethically focused, and culturally collaborative and morally responsible exhibits. This research helps guide the next generation of blockbusters. Here's my bibliography, and thank you.
Thank you, Summer. That was really, really interesting. Just a reminder, everybody, that at the end of the next few blocks of presentations, we will have time for questions. So please do, if you think of any, pop them in the chat and I can save them up for later. So moving on to our next speaker is Kenneth McElroy from the University of Glasgow, and he's going to be speaking about the economic and social value of archaeology to Caithness. So over to you.
Thanks, guys, and thank you for inviting me along to talk at the CIfA conference. It's a real pleasure, and well done to everyone who's talked so far. Very interesting subjects. So I should point out that I am quite early on in my academic career as well. Even though it doesn't look like I am definitely a mature student. But here I am entering the first day of school 4 years ago at the age of 28, and I am due to finish studying at the University of Glasgow in about 8 days, actually. That's my final exam. So my study essentially is on the value of archaeology to Caithness, my home county, where I've kind of grown up and learned to love archaeology. And I've always been interested in archaeology from a very young age. Here I am around about 1995 at Skara Brae, when you could actually meander around the corridors and alleyways of the prehistoric settlement. For some reason, I'm decked out in an English rugby top. And I can assure you that I'm a Scottish rugby and football fan, especially now that they're quite good at sport. So not sure why I'm wearing that. And my interest in archaeology has kind of developed over the years. I would actually return to Orkney in 2015, where I made a very cool grooveware pottery find at the Ness of Brodgar. And that's continued right through to 2020, when I was able to excavate a Kosovan site, a Roman site called Dresnik, where I found a very cool Roman fibula. Just as a wee side note, when I arrived in Orkney in 2015, it was voted as the most romantic place in the UK. I don't know if that has anything to do with anything, but I thought it worth mentioning. But my main interest, I suppose, is public archaeology and the kind of public side of archaeology, especially in a Caithness context where I was born and where I was raised. For a number of reasons, I suppose, but perhaps the most pertinent reason is the closure of Dunray nuclear power plant, which is due to be completely decommissioned by around about 2040. Now, for a number of years, Dunray has provided economic security for Caithness. It has, as you can see here, it's provided £6 to £8 million into the local economy. This was at £80 million only a few years ago. There are currently around about 1,200 employees at Dunray. That accounts for nearly 5% of the total population of Caithness, and it actually accounts for about 1 in every 5 jobs in Caithness. So as you can see, there's been a bit of a sort of monoculture in terms of employment, which is not great, especially if this is a finite means of employment, which is due to be decommissioned. And this has led the Highland Council to suggest that Caithness will face a pretty staggering rate of depopulation of over 20% over the next 20 or so years. 6,000 people or 5,500 people doesn't sound like an awful lot, but you've got to look at this kind of proportionally. If it would be like Glasgow losing 125,000 people or London losing about 2 million people. And that's a constant hemorrhaging of people rather than a kind of circulation of people. This is losing bodies, losing individuals. So Caithness now needs to consider new means of economic security, sustainability, and even success. And as you can see here, Drake knows that too. So one avenue that I would consider as a possible means of providing economic security in the region would be through tourism. And as you can see, it's big business in the Highland region. And I thought that would attract the attention of Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos there. You get out of it, lads. But it makes about £1.2 billion from tourism in the Highland region. And that's a fair proportion of the overall kind of number that Scotland makes from tourism, which is around about £5.2 billion from tourism. So if we know that the Highland region makes £1.2 billion from tourism, why study Caithness? Well, Caithness specific tourism reports are limited and I would say non-existent. And on top of that, the Highland region is a hugely diverse area, actually. The problems and challenges and issues that face Skye are not necessarily the same problems and issues that affect Caithness. So on top of that, there's no real understanding, as I explained, in terms of tourism reports, because Visit Scotland only study local authorities, essentially. Caithness is not a local authority, it is an historic region, a lieutenancy, and culturally, geographically, geologically, and archaeologically, it's quite different to a lot of the Highland region as well. And so I believe it would be advantageous, and it actually deserves to be studied separately. And as you can see, it's got a real wealth of archaeological sites. I'm not saying quantity is better than quality, but it certainly does have huge potential in terms of archaeology and with that heritage tourism. And that's largely through the context that I've looked at the economic value of archaeology to Caithness. So, and in addition to that, it's worth noting that our neighbours to the north do rather well out of tourism, and certainly heritage tourism, and archaeology plays a big part of that. As you can see here, this is from the Visit Scotland and Orkney Islands Council survey from 2019, that it's quite important, or rather archaeology and history and culture are important reasons for people visiting. And whenever I visit, I mean, it's 100% for this cat that you can get at the Broch of Gurness. So absolutely worth visiting Orkney just to see this guy. In terms of visitors, this was calculated through overnight stays. The Orkney Islands Council and Visit Scotland survey didn't even include cruise ships, which is a huge contributor to the local economy. Tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people pass through Orkney just on the cruise ships. So on any given day, it looks a bit more like this in Orkney. But in terms of visitor numbers, it's around about 192,000 visitors to Orkney in 2019. So there was existing research to emulate, thankfully. Ecos Consultants Archaeology in the Outer Hebrides, which was carried out in 2017. Actually, my mother inspired that, and she cut that out for me about 4 years ago, and I've had it since then. So thank you very much to my mum for that. So there it is there. Essentially, they suggest that archaeology is worth £4 million to the Western Isles, and Orkney, by the same token, it's worth about £9 million to Orkney as well. So there are some key statistics and kind of a comparison that I could use for my own study. And if the numbers were relatively similar to in my own study to this, I was quite happy. So I was looking for something between £4 and £9 million in terms of economic value. So where did I have to start? Well, because as I mentioned earlier, there's literally no Caithness specific tourism reports. There was no understanding of how many people visited Caithness, which is a particularly tricky thing to kind of understand. And I thought the best way of doing that would be to try and ascertain the number of overnight stays, which essentially involved me phoning dozens of campsites, hotels, bed and breakfasts, and asking them for their visitor numbers. In 2019, I should point out, because 2020 was an irregular year, shall we say, and many businesses were simply not open at all. So I thought we'd look at 2019. This was, made slightly more difficult. This was compounded by the fact that a lot of businesses don't actually keep records for total number of guests, and instead they just don't take it, or they outsource that kind of information. So many could only give me with estimates. Although comparing that with the businesses who were able to give me exact figures, none of the businesses gave me anything that was too wild. So I was quite comfortable with the figures that I was presented with. So, and here's something that I learned to do on PowerPoint. The total number of visitors that I calculated was 182,421 in 2019, and I was very happy with that, because that seemed to me quite similar to the Orkney numbers. In addition to this, I collected online responses to better understand tourist impressions of Caithness and their motivations in visiting the region too. Got a nice mix of people. Largely they were from Scotland and the UK, with a smaller number coming from North America. And this actually broadly reflected the Visit Scotland's assessment of the Highland region as well. So I was happy with that too. So the key findings, as discussed, 182,421 overnight visitors. Perhaps one of the most surprising outcomes was that most were holidaying specifically to Caithness, as opposed to visiting Orkney or doing the North Coast 500, which would be at odds with a lot of the hoteliers and accommodation providers that I spoke to, as well as the general populace of Caithness as well, who didn't really hold Caithness in high regard when it came to tourism, but we'll come to that. 73.3% were attracted by the archaeology of the region, which I think is a pretty staggering number, actually. When you look at the Western Isles was 44%, according to the ECOS study, and 87.3% had visited an archaeological site, and that's compared with 80% in Orkney, again using the ECOS study as a comparison. So quite significant numbers in terms of archaeology. Archaeology was actually the main reason for a return visit, which was excellent to see, and the average spend was about £281.87, which again broadly aligns with the Visit Scotland Highland visitor profile, which was about £235. I should caveat this by saying I'm an undergrad and I am not well versed in research, and I think that these figures are going to be somewhat imprecise, or perhaps cautious. For instance, I didn't include visiting friends and family, and that's because ECOS study had it at about 22%, and visiting friends and family as a reason to visit the Highland region was about 17% for the Visit Scotland. So my study, it was the most important reason, or it was the most highly ranked reason for visiting Caithness, and so that skewed my results somewhat, and I just decided not to include it, or include the visitors. So I mean that may have skewed the figures. That may mean that I was more cautious, or it's undoubtedly imprecise, I think. So I apologise for that. But regardless, I mean, it's obvious that archaeology is a tremendously important reason for people visiting, or people who had visited, and for prospective visitors as well. It was one of the most important reasons to visit Caithness. And as you can see here, about 78.3% of visitors ranked it as 7 out of 10 or more in terms of influencing their desire to visit Caithness. Now, here's some boring math stuff, which I won't really go into too much detail because I'm conscious of how much time I've got. But essentially, the total tourist spend is about £33.5 million in Caithness, which I was reasonably satisfied with. And I was quite happy with the value of archaeology to Caithness as well, as being around about just over £6 million. And given the reasons stated by people for visiting Caithness, I'm not surprised that even if the total tourist spend is lower than that of the Western Isles and Orkney, the fact that archaeology ranked so highly in their estimations for a visit, I was quite happy with that. So aside from the economic value, because I don't want to sound like too much of a cynic or just interested in money, I'm very interested in the more kind of intangible benefits of archaeology and history as well. And I think this is a burgeoning area of research. And if you look up the hashtag archaeobenefit, you'll see some great work by a number of archaeologists who are currently researching this in a lot more detail. But that includes or incorporates generally a number of concepts and themes associated with well-being, which I kind of separated into a number of themes. So belonging, health, pride of place, education and skills, community, identity, appreciation and understanding, even just happiness, because I don't know if too many people go to a site like a castle or Skara Brae and go, yeah, this was really good. I felt like this was really good for my belonging. You go because you want to go and because you're interested. You don't need to delve too deeply into why you do these things. And I doubt a lot of people do that, really. And as I said, it is quite intangible. It's a sort of thing that we do without sometimes realising it, or a lot of people do without realising why they do it. I think this is summed up by the Historic Environment Scotland blog, which says that more people than ever might be engaging with their local heritage and reaping the well-being benefits, but they might not know it. Exemplified by this couple here, who were sitting on an old earthwork at Queen's Park, where I live. And I thought, well, this is a lovely photograph that I could take of them. And I asked if I could take their picture, because they were interacting with the archaeology without them realizing it. And they looked at me as if I had two heads. You know, they really couldn't understand what I was talking about. So that wasn't very good. So again, online survey was carried out to understand the benefits of archaeology, or the value of archaeology in a social sense. And this was just largely, well, this was intended for people with a connection to Caithness, i.e. they were from Caithness or they presently lived in Caithness, so they could have moved there or they could have lived there all their lives. Again, a decent mix in terms of the demographics. And I won't go into too much detail because this bit is just a bunch of graphs. But, you know, the long and short of it is that archaeology is good for you. And I think we probably all know that, really. But it's difficult to kind of validate that without, you know, a series of graphs, essentially, to kind of point out that archaeology is good for people. And as you can see here, you know, 69.5% said it increased their sense of belonging. 90%, this was a particularly high number, believe that it made them feel healthier, and that's inherently connected to the fact that most archaeology is set in the great outdoors, and so people were able to, you know, get fit and fresh air, just being outside and being in amongst nature was a big benefit. You know, 66.3% of people said that it increased their appreciation and understanding of Caithness. You know, 81.8% said it made them more proud to live in Caithness. 66.7% suggested it was played an important role in their identity. 83.7% thought that it brought communities together, and 83% thought that it kind of essentially made them feel better, made them happier. That was actually asked across three kind of themes: archaeological sites, museums, as well as archaeological events such as excavations or even talks, things like that. And across the board, the numbers were very similar. Essentially, people thought that all of these things put together were very good for your well-being for a number of reasons. It was interesting to note, however, that when I asked Caithnessians, do you think the historical and archaeological sites of Caithness are promoted enough to tourists, 82.5% said no. And also I asked, what do you think are the main reasons why tourists visit Caithness? And only 9% said history and archaeology. And if you compare that with the earlier statistic that 73.3% of people visit the region for the archaeology, that's quite a disparity, I think. So all of this leads me to suggest that there should be more investment in archaeology, certainly in Caithness. And this chimes with the views of locals as well, who think that there should be more financial investment, both from local funders such as wind farms, but also national bodies as well, Heritage Lottery Fund, things like that. And again, that would also chime with the views of visitors to the region who felt that Caithness wasn't represented well enough in national advertising campaigns, and that Caithness wasn't promoted, that Caithness itself didn't promote itself enough. So I think there's a lot of work there to be done, and now there's some evidence there to suggest that this should be done. And on a kind of broader scope, I think it's important to point out the ways in which archaeology enriches our lives, both financially enriches our lives, but also in a way that it benefits any number of themes, our well-being, our identity, our pride of place, our general happiness. And I think it's important that we recognise that now, especially in the face of news where archaeology is being cut left, right and centre across universities, and that there seems to be this opinion that it's perhaps not particularly important besides engineering and things like that. But I think it's important that we do recognise the value of archaeology. It's not just Caithness that I think you can apply this study to. It could be applied to a number of places, and I would encourage other people to do the same for their own regions. So that, I hope, was 15 minutes. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay, so this actually follows on quite nicely from the end of that presentation before. This project is a small project at the beginning of my PhD research, which looks into archaeological evaluation techniques in the developer framework, and looking at our evaluation techniques in different environment types. So looking at what techniques are best in different areas with different construction and different landscape types that we come across. But I think, as the last presentation was saying, that this might come across as trying to create a one-size-fits-all policy for evaluation or whatever, but there is an inherent value in archaeology, and just because it's tied in with the construction industry doesn't mean that it doesn't have its own value. So archaeological work does currently, most archaeological work in the UK happens within the developer-led industry. When there's building, archaeology work takes place. I think it's something like 90% in 2015 was done as part of the construction industry. And the evaluation strategies, the evaluation stage of archaeology within the construction industry happens during the planning process, and it's required in the National Planning Policy Framework. It's required by law. And what happens is, before planning permission can be given, and I'm sure many people know this, evaluation takes place, often beginning with a desk-based assessment, but then an evaluation often takes place to inform the next decision on what should be done about the archaeology in the development area. And so effectively, field evaluation is a sample of the archaeology on the site. And this evaluation, the sample taken in an archaeological evaluation, is very critical for informing this future work. This is what allows us to make decisions on whether there should be an archaeological excavation before development happens, whether or not it should be a watching brief, whether or not there's no archaeology there. And this process, this sampling process, is because it's such a critical stage of our archaeological process, it has to be really understood. And so this, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. So what are the outcomes of the sample that you can have in an archaeological evaluation? It's because the sample is a diagnosis about the archaeology within a development area. You can either have the correct diagnosis, so you're actually understanding the archaeology present, you're understanding the nature, extent, quality, quantity, you're able to perhaps price it and go further and give an accurate estimate for what the developer would have to pay to excavate it. And you can move on to these decisions. And you could also get a true negative where the archaeology is absent and you're equally informing your next decision with the correct information. But we can also make the mistake and have a false negative where the archaeology is present, but we're not seeing it, or we have a false positive, which perhaps from an archaeological point of view is not such a problem, but perhaps for developers, this is a huge problem because then they'll be paying for archaeological work, which perhaps wouldn't be needed to. So how this piece of work fits within my PhD as just looking at evaluation as a sampling strategy. This isn't the wider question of evaluation, which has a lot more intricacies and a lot more real world issues. This study just goes into how well are we understanding sampling with trenching, and it does it through GIS. So previous studies have looked at how evaluation trenching, which as I said is the sample of the development area, how accurate it is. And the current UK norm for evaluation trenching is about 2 to 5% of a development area is trenched usually. And although often these trenches and evaluations are targeted and they're based on prior knowledge, this is usually not the case for the entirety of a site. Often there's some areas which we don't know about, and there's often some areas which are very large, which we don't know about. And often these are the areas where these incorrect diagnoses can happen. And they're often also the areas where we're putting down grids of trenches at the 2 and 4%, 5% area. I think HS2, a lot of the plans were laid out at about 4% trenches. But actually, previous studies have shown that if you're trenching at lower than 10% of a development area, you're perhaps getting unreliable evaluation results. And there's also been shown that we have, as archaeologists, have an overestimation of how well an evaluation informs our next decisions. Actually, it's often not the case. So this study aims to build on this previous work and try to understand actually how evaluations are, how well do we understand evaluations, and trying to get an idea of a variability of the results from archaeological evaluation samples. And so this study focuses on the effect that the distribution and density and quantity of archaeological features affects the results of a trenching or test pit survey. So how do you do this? One of the difficulties with an archaeological evaluation is the whole point of the process is to find out what archaeology is in a development area. We don't know what archaeology is in the development area, so we don't know how representative our sample is of the archaeology in a development area. So this study uses hypothetical, at the beginning it uses hypothetical archaeological layouts on a GIS environment and repeating these simulations to then see how simulations of trenching and simulations of test pits would have found these known hypothetical archaeological sites. So I've made controlled archaeological areas, which I know the quantity of the features, and I know the size of the features, and I know the different types. And then I can look what sites are, what features and what types of features are being over or underrepresented. So first of all, a map was made, and this is just the scale of these hypothetical maps, and it's made in over 121 50 by 50 meter grid squares. So this is effectively our hypothetical development area. And then a number of different layouts were made, just on arbitrary layouts were made on an Excel sheet to represent a multi-period archaeological site. So here's an example of one. What we've got is all the features are divided up into 3 types of features. And although this is a real dumbing down of the complexities of archaeology, it gives us, once we can get a handle on this, sampling this more simple archaeological sites, we can then feed in real world data and have a look at the complexities. So I used three sizes of archaeological feature, just small, large, and long. So here they are. Here's a small pit, which actually for a site would be quite a kind of medium size or large pit in my experience. So the radius is 0.5 meters. And then we have a kind of larger circle of just with a radius of 5 meters and a kind of ditch representative, which is 30 meters long. But of course, these are just representations and allow the study to have a look at how shape and size of features, what we're detecting more. And we can add more complexity as we go on. And then if we look back at this, I've also split the abundance of features. So this is a table of 1,210 features. That's 10 features for every grid square if you wanted to lay it out in a uniform way. I've actually divided them up into just these arbitrary types. So if you look, there's 710 features of type 1, but there's only 40 of type 4. And these types with differing abundance are just representatives of perhaps periodicity. So if you might expect on a normal archaeological site to have more in certain areas, to have more commonly find Roman, but you might not find a rarer type like perhaps the Neolithic. Within the UK, we have a huge amount of variance of periods being rare in some areas and not rare in others. But it's important to remember that the period of archaeology does also affect what we might expect to find, and are we overlooking different periods of features and finds. So this is what these types represent. And so here's an example of one of these hypothetical archaeological sites. It's all grouped in the middle and it's multi-period. So you have the different types just in the bottom. And as you can see, type 1 is the most common and type 4 is the least common. And then, as I said before, I've generated different grid layouts over these hypothetical archaeological maps. And first and foremost, I've used a standard grid layout of trenches, which is the most common layout used in the UK, and it's been proved by previous studies to be the most effective at finding archaeological features and finds in an area. So this shows a 4% coverage of a development area, which wouldn't be perhaps uncommon in the UK. And I'm aware that this is a huge simplification of archaeological evaluations. Usually you would never ever see an entire area with a grid layout. We'd have targeted trenching. We'd have perhaps just a small area where some trenches are used as a diagnosis tool for a detection. We usually have some idea of the archaeology in an area. But I think it's still important to look at this, at our idea of how effective we are at finding our unknowns. So then what the study does is it uses trench layouts and test pit layouts of at different percentage coverage, and it overlies the hypothetical archaeological sites. So this one has 3 groups of archaeology and looks at how well they are, how well each simulated evaluation would find the archaeology, and then find the different types and allow the analysis of these different evaluation samples. Each 1 to 15% layout in this study is repeated with a different layout, different angle or different slightly moved in its corner coordinates. So no layout is laid out the same way twice, and it's repeated 100 times. So we get to see the variability of how well these evaluation techniques of trenches and test pits would find the archaeology. Yeah, and I've just explained that. So yes, what we've got is we can analyze not only how the different layouts of archaeology affect the trench, affect the evaluation sample, but we can also look at how the different coverage of trenches affects the evaluation sample. So all the features were recorded, and we get this simulated conclusion of what the evaluation would have found, the information from these hypothetical evaluation samples. So I'm afraid this is just begun, and I've just began running this all on Python, so it's all running through. So I can only really give you the preliminary results, but one of the first and most obvious results that we've been seeing is the higher coverage of trenches you have, the higher amount of archaeological features you detect. And so this is a running mean graph. And so this is actually at 1% in the green, and this is 5% in the blue. And as you can see, this is total number of features of 1,210 features. And you can see that, of course, 5%, as you'd expect, is finding more than 1%. But if we look at this a bit closer and we just look at the blue 5%, we can see that we actually have a lot of variation within our evaluation results as we repeat it. So we're seeing that although this is the same 5% coverage of trenches, this graph, you're seeing that you're getting different results each time. However, the next question, I suppose, is, although you get variation within the results, how acceptable is the variation? Because if you look here, this is over a uniform layout. So what we found, I'll move on to that later, but if this over a uniform layout, you see that the variation is actually about 10 features. So is that acceptable? Can we allow that? I suppose that's actually the next question, and that's for other people to discuss, and that's for policy. What variation do we find acceptable within our evaluations? But it's important to know how varied our evaluations are. And another thing we're able to analyze is how, as the aim of this study, is how the different quantities of archaeological features affect the evaluation sample. So this is, the green is the same map, so the same shaped map, but that's a uniform layout, so quite well dispersed across the entire area. But you're getting greater variation in your results when there's less archaeological features on the site. And if you go right down to very few features on the archaeological site, we're actually seeing a huge amount of variation and a chance that you're missing it. So that's very interesting. We'll be able to tease that out more as the research goes on, as the simulations run. We're also able to look at perhaps over or underestimation of different types of archaeological features. So this graph shows, as I mentioned before, we had 4 types, the rarest being type 4 and the most common being type 1. And actually here is type 4 in the blue, where although we've got a lot of variation, this is it as a percentage of itself. So the percentage of those 40 features found, we're kind of finding 13% at 3% in this group layout. But but the type 1, the most common, we're finding less. we're finding only about 9% of it. So that could affect how we're making these evaluation conclusions, how we're making the decision of the next stage. Are we overestimating perhaps the small finds on the edge? Are we underestimating? And this is change. What's interesting is that this is changing with how much you're putting into the different features, of course, how many features there are on site. But this is the same graph, but not shown as a percentage. And you can see that actually the type 1, which here is, you're only finding 9% of all the type 1 features on site. You're actually seeing, oops, sorry, I've gone up one. You're actually finding many, many more finds. And you're finding much, much less finds. So you're actually probably only finding under 10 of the type 4 finds, but you're finding many, many more. And again, we've got to take into how this information would overcrowd or inform our decisions at the next stage. Okay, so this is just a small insight into my preliminary results, which are very new. And what we want to do in the future is then look at, in this study, is introduce real world data with larger sites, larger areas, smaller features, finds, and we can look at also the difference in evaluation techniques, so not just trenching and test pits, but perhaps a combination of the two. And this will give us a real insight into how evaluation sampling fits in and what our detection is, what we're finding with our detection in archaeological evaluations. And then from this, we're going to move on to the actual real world complexities of evaluation of the different environment types and the other challenges that evaluation conclusions face. All the code that these simulations are run on will be available on GitHub. And so people will be able to test this out and make their own trench layouts over the archaeological sites as well, and their own GIS data, as long as you've got ArcMap. So that will be available when this comes out. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Richard. So we've got 2 more talks now, so this session's gone quite quickly. The next talk is from Courtney Piper from Durham University, but she's actually zooming in from the United States, so we're really pleased to have you. Thank you, Courtney. And your talk is future-proofing cultural heritage sites, an analysis of the response to climate change and the implications of sea level rise. Thanks very much.
So yeah, today I'll be discussing the current state of knowledge regarding sea level rise affecting coastal sites and highlight how kind of citizen science-based approaches, though very limited, are proving fundamental for climate change adaptation kind of strategies in the sector. This will be evident through 2 case studies. One is Scotland, the DENA project, or I'm sorry, the digital mapping project, and the other is DENA, the Digital Index of North American Archaeology project in the southeastern United States. This topic was actually derived from my dissertation, so it of course certainly includes kind of way more internal, external factors, including political relations, intergovernmental organizations, funding, etc. So the following is going to be just kind of a little discussion, one nodule really of this larger picture of climate change and heritage. So the current discourse of climate change and cultural heritage. Despite extensive discussion of global warming, rising seas, and coastal erosion, the anthropogenic climate change debate has really little involved itself with the archaeology and heritage sectors until the last decade or so. And we could say that this is maybe due to a sense of urgency as we're realizing how much of a potential loss of data is out there. The body of research specifically concentrating on sea level rise and climate change in regards to cultural heritage is growing, but remains very limited as well. Although we are seeing a lot of risk assessments and vulnerability reports, which is kind of the first step, little of the work predates the 21st century. And conversely, general references to archaeology in the environmental conservation field are scarce, and so there's a gap between the 2 disciplines. It's argued that this gap needs to be merged so heritage could be employed to further development climate change awareness, possibly starting within the heritage tourism industry itself. But before we can bring together, the fields of nature conservation, cultural heritage conservation, and sustainable development, really, it's imperative that the sharing of information about climate change impact on cultural heritage involves a participation from the individual public to the governmental or intergovernmental level. And this will be explored further in the upcoming slides by examining the national approach that we've seen with Scotland, definitely. So sea level rise is a predominant threat for heritage sites. Although the overall discourse of heritage sites has been largely left out of the climate change studies until recently, the concern for sea rise specifically can be traced back to publications as early as 30 years ago. 3 summaries produced by the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in the 90s stated that sea levels would rise about 6 centimeters per decade, resulting in a rate of about 20 centimeters by 2030. Now we're less than 10 years from this deadline, and it's recorded with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association that in some ocean basins, sea levels have already risen a projected 15 to 20 centimeters, if not more. So as we understand that the predictions are far more accelerated, it's causing kind of much issue, I think, and alarm for a lot of heritage professionals. The byproduct, more water and warming water, can only bring harm for sites that line the coasts around the world, of course, multiplying the already existing stresses that we have for archaeological and cultural heritage sites. This is not a singular event, of course, with sea level rise. It kind of appears in a variety of ways. This can include recurrent high tiding flooding events, amplified storm surges, and higher and greater wave energy, all of which will contribute to extreme coastal erosion. So what does this mean for coastal sites? Well, the completing and conflicting demands for suitable protection of coastal sites and land with which they reside on will inherently come with solution building, whether that's going to be positive or negative. We are saying within various scenarios that the preferred method and norm of in situ preservation for archaeological sites, especially on the coast, are now being confronted. Given that coastal erosion is a chain, the loss of the natural protective barriers along the coast critically expose the cultural heritage that may sit there. In order for coastal sites to remain as holy as they can, we have to address the land beneath the sites as well. Otherwise, all methods are futile. So some response and practice, examples of action in Scotland and the southeastern US. So the conversation, oops, I skipped ahead a slide, there we go. So the conversation of how and what to save or otherwise record should be a major topic in international adaptation planning for cultural heritage affected by sea level rise. Several countries, including Scotland and the US, have already shown kind of foresight and innovation in assessing the vulnerability of their coastal heritage sites through surveys on both sides of the Atlantic. These continue to reveal a large number of previously unrecorded sites and sites heavily at risk. Central to this discussion is noting that these 2 countries are privileged and that they have a significant level of established conservation organizations, funding, which greatly aid in supporting the initiatives. These levels of government interest, professional organization involvement, and funding may not yet be attainable for many developing countries where assistance for cultural heritage is direly needed. However, the insights and practical applications for these 2 examples serve to represent what effective models could accomplish. They result from a community-based approach and hopes to be integrated on localized scales, which I think is evident in the upcoming slides. In each of the examples that I'll kind of go over, a process of survey and prioritization has been applied to make actions more feasible. Long-term project sustainability and awareness is not necessarily guaranteed, however. So Scotland. Of course, with the second longest coastline in Europe, Scotland has more than 11,500 coastal archaeological sites identified so far. Nearly a third of that number was considered to need some sort of assistance due to coastal erosion and sea level rise. Just as some background, in 2015, Historic Environment Scotland was officially founded to be an executive non-departmental public body responsible for the investigation, caring, and promoting of Scotland's historic environment. In 2019, they produced a document titled A Guide to Climate Change Impacts on Scotland's Historic Environment. The guide divides Scotland's historic environment into 7 distinct components or elements that are shown on your screen there. The guide addresses, the impacts of sea level rise in specific, citing that the predictions for future sea level rise is stark in relation to its coasts. Shifting coasts and sea level rise is a key element for the country because of how clustered the coasts are with key infrastructures, including settlements, fortifications, roads, the industry that have all been the preferred setting for a variety of reasons for centuries. So since sponsoring dedicated coastal heritage surveys since the 1990s and aware of the growing crisis facing their coastal archaeology, Historic Environment Scotland established a new organization, the SCAPE Trust, which is Scotland's Coastal Archaeological and Problem of Erosion. It was based at the University of St. Andrews, and it creates new partnership projects with heritage managers, academics, and local communities. So already kind of having the idea of doing a more holistic, community-centered approach to management. So by 2011, about 30% of the coast had been investigated, recording over 12,500 coastal sites, in need of really urgent safeguarding. Building on Shore Watch, which was a community archaeology project coordinated by SCAPE, SCAPE would launch a new project in 2012 known as SHARP, Scotland's Coastal Heritage at Risk Project. The premise of the project was firstly to improve Shore Watch by creating Shore Update, which involved making existing records available through a web-based interactive sites at risk map. The interactive map was also formed on the basis of the Shore Update mobile app, which kind of democratized participation by making select data accessible and allowing new sites to be recorded kind of at the hands of your fingertips, or trained volunteers downloaded the records and maps onto their device and use GPS functions to navigate to sites where they can update condition records and take photographs as shown on the image on your screen on the right. So between 2012 and 2017, over 1,000 records were updated through the app, showing some of the sites underwent significant changes since the mid-1990s. Some coastal sites had been damaged or destroyed altogether within that time frame as well. So the project kind of already demonstrates that a citizen science-based approach, inclusive of national support, of course, can orchestrate prompt action. It can also produce meaningful data for heritage management and can be deployed elsewhere responsibly in the same notion. So jumping over to the other side of the Atlantic, we have similar projects similar to SHARP that have been initiated kind of really outside the US, but UK, Europe, and the United States. So the US is different in that legislation and management practices between the states mean that approaches may vary from place to place. It's not as cohesive. One comprehensive project in particular has found a way to kind of navigate that, however. So the Digital Index of North American Archaeology, DINA project, is a multi-institutional collaboration that allows researchers and heritage professionals online access to linked heritage data sets. The project was undertaken in cooperation with governmental, academic, and tribal stakeholders. So since 2012, DINA has compiled archaeological site file data from 15 states in Eastern North America, comprising of over 500,000 sites already, which is pretty big. The publicly accessible assemblage includes existing archaeological site files, collections, and report data from multiple regional, state, and local sources, linked with other archaeological databases. So although it's open access, So although it's open access, DINA does not publish or source, or store precise coordinates online. I think that's one of the bigger issues people think is having this too much information to sites, but that's something to note that within both of these, the information is not kind of fully public accessible. The initial data collection, though, and integration phase was managed by a largely voluntary team from several institutions in the Southeast. So a particular phase of the project was to explicitly assess cultural heritage sites located on the southeastern United States. The study draws on archaeological site recordings from 8 states in total, encompassing most of the sites on the Atlantic and Gulf Coast, which amounts to almost 130,000 total sites, as shown on the right, the red being already kind of at or below current sea level. Me being from Florida, I live very close to a Native American site, and so it's always kind of been in my backyard, so to speak, and most of the shell middens and Native American sites around Florida, as you can see, which are a lot of these recorded sites, have been underwater for quite some time now. Spanning from Maryland to the Texas-Louisiana border, the analysis develops a GIS-based inventory, and the site data for Mississippi, you'll see, is missing because due to the dates that they are arranging this, they didn't have the data transfer, I guess, at time of publication. However, it has since been updated this past year with a few sites on the coast of Mississippi. So as of October 2017, professionals from 21 states are actively participating in the upkeep of this project. The project has initiated discussions with other authorities and practitioners in the remaining 28 states and possibly other countries. The goal would to ideally be create kind of an intercontinental database. DENA demonstrates how a cohesive archaeological database can prove useful for research mitigation and at least at the very little almost public education for what we currently have and what currently or what's at a future state for being lost. So discussion and conclusion. Like I said, that was kind of a quick snippet. There's all sorts of other factors to consider, including the intergovernmental role, such as UNESCO. They recently kind of come out with a few publications and plan for how they're going to handle World Heritage Sites and climate change, especially coastal sites. But really this discussion, I kind of wanted to focus, would just find that global strategies for cultural heritage to address sea level rise kind of have stalled since awareness was first generated at the beginning of the millennium. Hopefully new methods of research, recording, and mitigation in the current discourse prove that successful strategies can be executed and then utilized. Citizen science, based approaches like that of Sharp in Scotland help to make heritage management relevant to a wider set of populations, connecting more people to the impacts of sea level rise and climate change impacts, which is the ultimate goal. Further, an approach is such, presents opportunity to openly discuss climate change and heritage loss within communities so that they can have a part in planning accordingly for future situations. As the dialogue continues to evolve, suggestions are made for the continued study of cultural heritage and climate change in our field. Studies in relation to Indigenous communities and their cultural heritage, however, are also in the infancy stages. All of this poses a bigger question for the future of site branding, accessibility to the public, and ultimately conservation. Nevertheless, I kind of hope this discussion maybe stirred some interest or, kind of successfully directed its efforts towards contributing to just the expanding dialogue regarding coastal archaeology's future. Thank you.
Thank you, Courtney. Thank you, that was brilliant. And moving on to our final presentation of the session, it seems to have gone really quickly, but we're moving on now to Nicolas Crabb from the University of Brighton, who will be talking to us about remote sensing for the reconstruction and mapping of archaeological resources in alluvial environments.
Okay, great. So just to give a bit of an overview of what I'd like to talk about today, I'm going to, the title of my project is Remote Sensing for the Reconstruction and Mapping of Archaeological Resources in Alluvial Environments. So I'll briefly look at why alluvial environments are such an important resource, and then briefly think about what current approaches we have to investigating these areas, and then how we might incorporate some contemporary remote sense data to try and increase our understanding of these areas prior to any developments or anything like that may happen in these areas. And I'll explore all of these through a case study site that I'll present later on. Okay, so why are alluvial environments so important? River valley systems have provided a really resource-rich location for past human activities throughout history, particularly for early prehistoric societies. And these depositional contexts or conditions can provide an opportunity to place these archaeological records in a relatively secure temporal and environmental context. So the depositional conditions can enable paleoenvironmental remains to be very well preserved, as you can see in some of the examples on the right there. However, the detection of archaeological resources within these landscapes is very challenging. And this is predominantly because fine-grained alluvial sediments can deeply bury or conceal archaeological sites, although this can also serve to preserve these remains in good condition. These sediments are often very thick, so in excess of 1 meter, which means that most common methods of archaeological prospection either through shallow geophysical techniques such as gradiometer surveys or aerial photographs will be relatively ineffective. However, we can model zones of archaeological and paleoenvironmental through studying these environments through a number of different techniques. So within any river floodplain setting, there are an assemblage of landforms that provide a record of the evolution of a river system. So this can contain paleochannels, river terraces, and topographic high point gravels. And these different landforms strongly influence the distribution and type of archaeological remains that you may anticipate within these environments. So understanding the morphology and sedimentary sequence of these environments is really very vital for understanding or predicting archaeological potential in these areas. As you can see in the bottom left image here, this is a sort of characterization of how an alluvial environment or how archaeological remains may be distributed within an alluvial environment typically. So you have areas of higher, drier areas that may contain archaeological remains, and then lower lying or paleochannel features that may not necessarily contain any archaeological remains, but will have relatively well-preserved paleo-environmental remains that can be really important for contextualizing these landscapes. And then in the center of the valley, you have this gradual vertical accretion or buildup of alluvium, overbank sedimentation, essentially. And this is particularly important as any threats to these resources through infrastructure or development can obviously be quite destructive to these archaeological paleo-environmental remains, and it's quite difficult to predict where they might be located, as most prospection techniques are ineffective. So the current methods that are often deployed to try and understand these environments include a wide range of different techniques, and the sophistication and diversity of these has increased in recent years. And this is largely developed in tandem with the growth of developer-funded archaeology. One of the more significant ones is the determination of zones of archaeological potential or paleo-environmental potential through computational deposit modeling. And an example there on the right, where you're basically trying to model the subsurface topography of an area through boreholes or other intrusive techniques to try and predict locations where archaeological activity may have occurred. And as I say, this is normally achieved through intrusive methods, but the analysis of different landforms through remotely sensed data, as well as geophysical survey, can have significant potential to aid the investigation of these environments. So remote sensing in archaeology has a very long history. Crop marks have been mapped from aerial imagery for over a century, but their visibility varies considerably according to the climate and the soil or the geology that may be present. So better draining soils or on gravels or chalk will be more likely to produce crop marks, whereas any sort of clay-rich environments may be less likely to produce good contrast, although there are obviously a number of exceptions to that. In addition, the mapping of alluvial landforms from aerial photographs has also been undertaken for a variety of archaeological and geomorphological purposes. But identifying specific features and defining areas or interpreting these data sets in terms of their archaeological potential remains a significant challenge. However, in more recent years, there's a sort of proliferation of contemporary digital techniques, including a wide range of remote sensing data sets. And this can include LiDAR, which is probably most of you are familiar with it to some extent. It can also include synthetic aperture radar or SAR, as well as multispectral and hyperspectral imaging. And these can be all mounted on different platforms. So they can be satellite borne or they can be airborne, as well as more recently through UAS or drone mounted instruments. And all these different techniques have various different advantages and limitations, and they're fairly dependent on the spatial, spectral and temporal resolution. So by which I mean, what is the sort of the ground sampling distance. So typically you've got to think about the size of the archaeological feature you're trying to map, and then also what time of year you're collecting this data, because crop marks are heavily dependent on the time of year. But also the spectral resolution, by which I mean the portions of the EM spectrum that are being covered by these different techniques. These different ranges of the EM spectrum can inform us of different ground surface characteristics. So LiDAR, which is typically in the infrared and visible part of the spectrum, would give you very accurate measurements of topography, as well as optical imagery or anything multispectral imagery, which covers the visible and near infrared parts of the spectrum as well, will give you a measurement of or an understanding of the physical state of vegetation. And the key advantage to that is that some subsurface archaeological features may be better expressed in non-visible near-infrared wavelengths. And research within river floodplains has also shown a significant benefit to these techniques. Here's just a very quick example from a site in Carnuntum in Austria. And you can see there's the aerial imagery on the left, or the it's aerial imagery, but collected using the visible part of the spectrum. And on the right-hand side, there's the inclusion of the near-infrared data, which provides you can see how that interpretation in the bottom images is vastly increased. There's a number of different additional features that are more apparent within those data sets. So with all of these technological advancements, remotely sensed data sets are increasingly accessible for geoarchaeological research, but they remain relatively untapped for this particular application. So the aims of my PhD project is to try and use some of these data sets to model interpretations of the River Valley system, and then examine the relationship between the surface response of these features and how that relates to subsurface variability. I'd also like to try and develop a methodology for wider application of these techniques, and we'll see how successful that is in the application of these data sets in a case study area in the Lower Lug Valley, which I'm going to now talk about in a bit more detail. So the Lower Lug Valley is located in Herefordshire. It's between Hereford and Leominster. The River Lug itself is characterised by a relatively high degree of sinuosity, and the alluvial corridor is relatively wide in this area. So in this case, it's detailed by the yellow area, and it's about 2 to 3 kilometres wide here. The depth of the alluvial sediment within that valley is highly variable, but it's typically between 2 to 3 metres deep, and it overlies these sands and gravels, Devonsian sands and gravels and old red sandstone. Most of the recorded archaeology within this area is located at the periphery of the floodplain, as you might expect. So you've got crop marks associated with Bronze Age enclosures and funerary sites, Iron Age hill forts, and Roman settlements, all on the edge of the floodplain where it's higher and drier. But within the floodplain itself, you've got more post-medieval activity, which is highlighted in the green there. And it's typically associated with ridge and furrow ploughing and water meadow systems. However, remains from earlier periods are likely to be present within the alluvial floodplain itself. And when quarry works have been carried out in the area, they've highlighted a whole range of different features, covering the whole of human history. And so within the Lower Lug Valley itself, there's 2 significant quarry sites, Wellington Quarry and Lug Bridge Quarry, and both of these have shown significant remains, and I'll briefly highlight these. Additionally, they're also often associated with important paleo-environmental remains that enable us to reconstruct these landscapes in more detail. So Wellington Quarry is a relatively large sand and gravel extraction site, and when excavation started here, they have identified a whole range of different features, including a Romano-British villa, an Anglo-Saxon mill, but perhaps more significantly, considering that most of the remains are not necessarily earlier prehistoric on the edge of the floodplain, a Neolithic beaker burial and Bronze Age cemetery were also located, often in quite close proximity to former river channels or paleo channels. So we can see how those geomorphological features are influencing the location of archaeological sites. But also within these deeper areas of alluviation, there are archaeological sites to be found, they're just deeply buried. So the sediment sequence itself at Wellington Quarry is relatively complex, but it can be broadly reduced into these 3 key sediment units, which sort of look like a bit like a Neapolitan ice cream. But your latest deposits are these red alluvial silt clays, and they essentially seal all Romano-British and earlier deposits. After that, you've got all those features cut into a yellow alluvium, which then seals a number of different prehistoric features. And then at the very base of the sequence, you have this weathered Pleistocene gravel surface. And in amongst this, there's a number of different paleochannels and other alluvial landforms. At Lug Bridge Quarry, to the south of the study area, a similar range of sediments were identified, but an auger survey and subsequent monitoring and environmental sampling revealed that the nature of this landscape evolution in a bit more detail. So the sediment sequence here indicated that there were periods of rapid deposition interspersed with periods of slower aggradation. And this significantly means that there was at least 2 periods of stasis when occupation and human activity could have occurred more widely within the valley. And these occur in the Mesolithic through to the early Bronze Age and Roman and post-Roman periods. So that gives you a sort of impression of when the alluvial floodplain may have become more likely to be inhabited and more activity could have occurred at these times. During the monitoring of this site, no further archaeological features were identified, but within the wider landscape, this has a number of different implications for the wider landscape by trying to understand how this landscape's evolved. So in order to try and understand how this landscape evolved more widely, I tried to collect a load of gouge core transects throughout the valley to try and link the deposits between the two quarries, but also integrate it into the wider area. And this has helped clarify the nature of the landscape evolution, and it also allows for a more complete reconstruction of the sequences throughout the valley system. And you can generally see the trends that I've highlighted through those quarry sediment sequences throughout the valley. It also provides a really vital ground truthing for remote sense data, which is really the focus of the project. So the first data set that I'll briefly talk about with this case study is airborne LiDAR. And airborne LiDAR is a highly valuable resource. It's often, well, it is all freely available through open government licenses. So, and I think there's basically national coverage at 1 meter resolution now. So it's a really useful resource. It's highly effective at mapping geomorphological features that are expressed as topographic variation. And there's been a number of different studies that have highlighted the potential of this. Typically, well, there's a whole range of different ways of visualizing LiDAR data, but for a geoarchaeological sort of application, a diverging color scale is often enough. So the red here is the higher bits, and the green into yellow and blue is the lower lying areas. And you can see there that a paleo channel has been identified adjacent or on the eastern side of the River Lug. And there's a number of other different features as well within that, such as I'll see if I can get my laser pointer up very briefly. There we go. So just around this area, there's a slight rise, and this may be associated with a gravel island, which would have probably been consistently higher and drier. So it would have been attractive, or not necessarily inhospitable, basically. It wouldn't have been regularly flooded. So it's an area of potential for archaeological remains to be located. I also used some synthetic aperture radar data from the Cosmos Climate constellation, which is from the European Space Agency. And SAR data isn't very commonly used for archaeological purposes, but it can detail variations in sediment particle size, density and texture, as well as the dielectric constant and moisture content of the ground surface. So it can give you a number of different parameters of the types of sediments that you're looking at, or at least some perspective of dielectric permittivity of the ground. It's been predominantly deployed in desert regions because to some extent it can penetrate dry sand and detect buried structures. So it can be very useful there, but it's less effective in vegetated areas for archaeological feature detection, but it can be used. Some higher resolution systems, such as the Cosmos Skymed, are probably most suited to these applications. They also typically provide a high temporal resolution, by which I mean there's constant regular revisiting times of these data sets allows you to sort of select the most optimum data set. And within this particular case, I acquired 74 different images over the last 6 years, and then sort of tried to cherry pick the most important ones. In this particular case, at the Lug Valley, the backscatter data itself didn't highlight very many clear features, but it was extremely effective at mapping the extent of flooding, which could then in turn be used as a proxy for archaeological potential. So this data set on the right is in fact a combination or a false color composite comprising three different SAR data sets over the course of the winter flooding episodes from 2019 to 2020. Just to give you an overall impression, that's how the SAR data looks individually. It's obviously quite coarse and grainy, but put together it can be relatively informative about mapping the extent of flooding and be used in relation to predicting archaeological potential. Lastly, I also collected some satellite multispectral data, or acquired it. I didn't go in the satellite myself and take the images, but yeah, I got hold of the data. And this enables me to characterize these alluvial landforms in more detail. And typically, you really need these higher resolution systems, so between 0.5 and 2 meter spatial resolution to be able to map them in any detail. So I acquired some World War II data, which is 0.5 meter when pan sharpened, which is essentially when it has a higher resolution band, and you can use that to sharpen your imagery. And the same for the Pleiades data set, which is another satellite system that I used. And I collected these data sets for particularly dry periods where we know crop marks are likely to be visible. The key difference between those systems is that World War II has 8 bands across the EM spectrum, so it enables you to slightly better characterize certain features. But as you'll see, the temporal resolution is one of the main significant factors. And you can produce a whole range of different images from these data sets. But in this case, I've just used false color composites, but you can produce spectral indices and other statistical methods which more directly correlate to plant health or other surface parameters. Within the data, you might be able to spot, again, you can see that that paleochannel on the right-hand side adjacent to the course of the river, as well as the gravel island, perhaps more clearly, and an area of lower lying land, which is represented in this sort of turquoise color here. And these images can be quite difficult to interpret in that the color schemes are obviously artificial, but essentially these red areas often relate to sort of healthy vegetation, and the drier areas are these turquoisey sort of areas. So this is the Worldview 2 data set. And you might be able to spot just at the top here, there is some remnants of channels, but it's not very clear because it's just been ploughed. However, later in the year, for the Pleiades data, you can really start to see some of the channels slightly better defined. And that's enormously useful for trying to characterize these areas. And these features obviously correlate quite well with the LiDAR data and the SAR data. So by combining all of these data sets, you can start to build up a picture of where archaeological sites may be located without really producing too many intrusive data sets. Although, as you'll see, I think they are integral to interpreting the landscape as well. This is just to highlight those features more clearly. Perhaps I should have shown that at the start, but there we are. So just to sum up, each remote sensing technique here has identified different geomorphological landforms that can be interpreted in terms of their archaeological and paleoenvironmental potential. And much of the complexity in the data corresponds with subsurface sediment architectures, by which I mean this sort of variation within the subsurface sediment that influences the location of archaeological sites. Although many of these landforms are deeply buried, so typically they're about 2 meters below the ground surface, they're still visible as an identifiable superficial response. And that's quite significant in that typically most prospection techniques will not work beyond a meter depth. And although you're not really necessarily seeing the features themselves, you're seeing essentially a proxy indication of that. So through vegetation health or through flooding, you're able to understand the subsurface more clearly. Yes, but it's essential to try and undertake some ground truthing to confirm these interpretations. And very, very quickly, the next stages of my research will be to explore other remote sensing data sets using UAS systems or UAS mounted instruments, and then do some targeted geophysical survey and look at how we can employ these techniques more widely. Okay, thank you very much for listening. Thanks for inviting me to speak as well. It's been an interesting afternoon.
You're welcome. Thank you ever so much, Nicolas. It's just been a really interesting session to get so many different papers on such vast areas of research. So I'm hoping that you've all enjoyed it as much as we have as well. So we've gone from museums and exhibitions, looking at the antiquities market, to economic and social value and tourism implications for archaeology, over then to more commercial archaeological issues, looking at archaeology evaluation technique, climate change, remote sensing. It's just fabulous. It really, really is.